everyone, and welcome to this month's WeatherWorks webinar. This was inspired from the seemingly increased variability of snowfall year to year, as well as quite a few lean winter seasons as of late, and that's been particularly true in the Northeast. So we decided to take a look at things from a data and a climate perspective, but more importantly, bring in one of the premier names in the snow and ice industry, Neal Glatt. And Neal is going to discuss things from a business standpoint, highlighting ways to not only run a sustainable business, but also a profitable one, no matter what Mother Nature has in store. So thank you, Neal, for joining, and I'm looking forward to an exciting half hour of discussion.
Thanks, Rob. Always excited to chat with you.
Cool. So as you can see here, Neal is a very distinguished individual after many years of really helping Case Snow Management be the company that it is today. He's gone on his own and he's done quite a few different things. Most notably, he is a managing partner at SnowFighters Institute. He is also a managing partner and co-founder at Grow the Bench, and I can attest firsthand to both of those. He does an excellent job with each of them. If you haven't heard of them, or if you haven't gone to either of those or participated in either of those, I would highly recommend looking into it. Me, on the other hand, maybe not quite as distinguished, but I've been with WeatherWorks for over 13 years. My title is the Director of Meteorological Services. I basically help run the operations here, particularly the forecast operations, and I also lead quite a bit of training and education. That's led me to places like SIMA, ASCA, and SnowFighters, where I've led workshops over the last 5 or 6 years. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to start with snowfall climatology, and then we're going to get into climate change and talk about how, if at all, has that affected snowfall in recent years. From there, Neal's going to talk about and kind of tie all that in from a snow and ice contractor standpoint, tying in contract types and developing a consistent, profitable business plan. You ready to get going? Let's get going. So let's start off with what is a snowfall climatology? Well, in its most basic form, it's historical snowfall data spanning years, decades, or in some instances, there's data for over a century. And this can be used to determine averages, extremes, seasonal variability, event magnitude breakdown, and a whole lot more. Now, coming from an outside perspective, to me, a snowfall climatology is a must for a great first step. And I think that's important for not only someone getting into the snow and ice industry, but for anyone who's established as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, Neal, but is this a good place to start?
You have to get this information. I mean, there's just our whole world is based on variability, and the question is, what variables do I have to be prepared for? If you don't have a climatology, you're just guessing, and it's why so many companies are struggling winter to winter, or especially depending on where you are in a winter like this past one.
Yeah, no, 100%. So, and like Neal just said, right? Ultimately, if you have the numbers and you really understand them, that data can really help structure your contracts and your business portfolio, and really help you weigh risk and ensure profitability. So, let's start out with a really basic use of a snowfall climatology. We'll look at Newark, New Jersey's last 30 years of snowfall data. And the first thing that probably stands out is, man, that is all over the place, right? It goes up and down, it goes up and down. How do I make sense of this data? So a really basic, good first step is to look at averages. And you can look at averages over a shorter time span, say a 3 or a 5 year average. You can look at it over a medium or longer range time frame, like a 10, 15, or 30 year. And you might notice a couple things right off the bat. The first is that the 10, the 15, and the 30 year are all pretty stable. They're all right around 30 to 33 inches. One of the biggest reasons is the more data set that you have, or more data you have in the data set, it starts to normalize, right? It gives you a true representation of what an average really should be over the long term. So that's why you see the 10, the 15, and the 30 all pretty dang close. The issue with looking at a shorter data set, such as a 3 or 5 year data set, is that 1 or 2 particularly anomalous winters can really skew it one way or the other. So when I did this, say 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of these really high winters in the 2000 kind of 12, 13, and 16, 17, and some of those winters that were actually skewing the 3 and the 5 year higher and inflating that and making it seem like you actually saw more snow than you actually did. However, as of recent, there's been quite a few leaner winters, so the 3 and the 5 year are really deflated the other way. So to get a really true idea of what average is, and we'll talk about why average you have to be careful with to begin with, but 10 or 15 is probably the gold standard. The 3 or 5 might take into account the shorter terms, right? And as you can see, Newark's been anywhere from about 22 to 32 inches, depending on what period of record that you look at. Now, if we go back and we plot that 22 to 32 degree, 22 to 32 degree. I can't say, I'm so used to saying 32 degrees when there's forecast and snow going on. 32 inches of snow. You see, it's only happened 5 times over the last 30 years. That's right, 5 times Newark has seen average snow over the last 30 winters. That is 1 out of every 6 winters. So right off the bat, that might be sounding some alarms, saying, hey, why am I planning for average winter when I don't see it? I see it, 2 times every 10 years if I'm lucky, right? And that's kind of the norm. I've done this case study for lots of different places across the country. The I-95 corridor seems to be the most volatile, but even across the board, the best case is usually 1 out of every 3 or 4 winters is about normal, with a whole bunch of winters that aren't. And also, if you're in Newark, you have to account for winters that could be close to 0 inches or as much as 80 inches of snow, right? That's a humongous range of possibilities mixed in with only a handful of average winters as well. So it makes it very, very difficult, right? And this is something that you've been experiencing. You've probably felt a little bit more as of recent because of the up and down winters. Let's take a look at another place out in Detroit. We'll kind of mix it up a little bit, and we'll kind of do the same exact thing. And you'll notice that Detroit's a little bit more stable. Their average is anywhere between 43 and 50 inches, depending on the period of record. You'll notice that it goes up and down over time, but they are a little bit more stable of a climate. They've had about 9 out of the last 30 winters be near normal. And they also are a little bit easier to budget because their baseline is about 20 to 25 inches. And outside of one anomalous year, most of the time they're only seeing the maximum of 70 inches. So you kind of have to plan for about a 50-inch spread, as opposed to Newark, you're literally planning for almost an 80-inch spread. Okay, so how do I get this data? So you can kind of get freely available data through NOAA, but it's not going to be quality controlled. It's not going to be zip code specific, that's for sure. It's only going to be at some of the main reporting airports across the country. I can tell you for sure, if you're in North Jersey and you want to use Newark's airport data for places that are not in Newark, it's not a good way to go about it. You're going to need something more specific, and that's something that we offer if you're interested in it. It's called a Snowtistics report. We do these zip code specific across the country. We can give you 5, 10, 15, some instances even 30 years worth of data, and it's going to be the blueprint for everything that Neal's going to talk about in just a little bit. All the data points that you need to understand your risks and develop a profitable business model. So on the left, you'll see, if you're like me and you like the numbers, lots of raw data. On a monthly standpoint, you'll have averages, you'll have medians. Averages is just the whole data set averaged together. The median is actually looking at the midpoint. So sometimes looking at the median can be a little bit more telling as opposed to the average. And we provide both of those for both the monthly and seasonal standpoint for snowfall totals, as well as the event magnitude breakdown, right? How many coatings versus 0.1 to 0.9s, salting, plowing, how many of those do I see in any given year on average? And then on the right, we get a little bit prettier, right? There's some nicer graphics over here, and you'll see snowfall plotted over the last 10 years. And this gray area is standard deviation. So that's a term you may or may not be familiar with. Standard deviation kind of looks to normalize data a little bit. And essentially one standard deviation, which is what this gray area is representing, is something that's going to happen about 2/3 of the time. So Neal will probably touch on this a little bit more, but ultimately what we should start doing with snowfall is not looking at the average number and expect that year to year, but start looking at average as a range of numbers and start trying to plan for that, right? It's a lot easier to plan for something that happens 2/3 of the time as opposed to something like in Newark that happens once out of every 6 winters. And you can see there's plenty more stuff to see when your peaks are. Newark averages the most snow in January and February, which isn't unlike most places across the country. And there's also event magnitude breakdowns to see how many salting, plowing, snow only, mixed events, ice only events you see as well. So lots of data to really help jumpstart your business and get a really nice baseline of where you're going to go from there. Okay, so Neal will tie more of this in just a moment. Before we get to him, I wanted to touch on one other kind of hot topic, and that would be climate change. Has climate change increased this volatility? Are there any defined trends one way or the other? So I did a couple different things, and we'll start with looking at reanalysis data. This is from I believe, a climatologist, Brian Brett Schneider, who plotted these. This isn't mine, but he looked at 50-year data using reanalysis data. and looked at what were the trends from basically 1973 to 2022. And on the left, you see the temperature trends, all basically in the oranges and reds. So one thing that's been pretty evident over the last 50 to 100 years is that the temperature has been increasing. There's really no debate with that. For a lot of the U.S., it's been mostly on the order of about 2 to, in some instances, 3 degrees increase, with a little bit more notable of an increase over the Southwest. In terms of snowfall, it hasn't quite correlated the same, right? You'll notice a lot of oranges and reds on this map. You don't notice nearly as many oranges and reds in the snowfall map. In particular, a lot of the northern part of the country, anywhere you're seeing these light blues or light yellows, I mean, that's plus or minus 5 or 10%. That could just be 1 or 2 years of data that are kind of skewing it. So there's really no big takeaways outside of maybe a decrease over the Southwest, where we also saw that increase in temperatures. And then the other thing you might notice is there's actually been an increase since the mid 70s into more recently in terms of snowfall on the East Coast. So again, I wouldn't take too much from this other than that it looks like things are warming. Snowfall hasn't changed too much, but we might have, if anything, seen an increase on the eastern seaboard versus a decrease kind of over the southern part of the country, which has been getting a little bit warmer. So let's take a look at a few locations more specifically. So this is some research that we did on our own. And we were going to start with I-95 corridor and look at a few other places across the country. So we plotted Boston and we plotted Philadelphia over the last 100 years. This is temperature data. This is just the seasonal or the yearly temperature data. And you can kind of see it goes up and down and up and down, but there's definitely been a notable increase. And if we put a trend line over that, it's been about 2 to somewhat 3 degrees of an increase over the last 100 years. And a lot of that, especially in the 95 corridor, increased urbanization could play a role in that as well. In terms of snowfall, you might make that correlation that increased temperatures leads to decreased snowfall, but that isn't necessarily the case. And I've done a whole bunch of these across a lot of the Northeast and the Midwest, and there really hasn't been a defined trend in snowfall really one way or the other. In fact, actually, Boston has seen an increase in snowfall. That's what these blue lines are showing. That's actually the 30-year rolling average. So we're not looking at year-to-year snowfall because that was all over the place. We're looking at 30 years of average data, averaging that together, moving forward 1 year in time, averaging that 30 years, moving forward 1 year, averaging that 30 years, and we do that rolling for over 100 years. So it kind of normalizes and smooths the data for us and gives us something that's more tangible. And you can see over those 30-year periods, there's actually a little bit of dip in the 30s and 40s, and it started to increase a little bit into the 60s and 70s, kind of flatlined for a while. And Boston actually is seeing an increase in snow over a 30-year rolling average as of recently. Philadelphia kind of declined a little bit from the start of this and sort of has just been steady state since. So really not a whole lot of takeaways in terms of the snowfall. However, you might be looking at those dots, and the dots that are plotted on this are showing the greatest changes from year to year. And we plotted the top 10 out of the last 100 years, basically showing that if it went from 20 inches to 80 inches, that's a 60-inch difference. That was probably going to make one of the top 10. And the biggest takeaway I think I have from this chart here is 8 of the 10 most volatile winters have happened over the last 30 years. So that's one initial takeaway that I'm seeing in the 95 corridor is that temperatures are rising. Snowfall is kind of steady state, maybe decreasing a little bit in the mid-Atlantic, maybe actually increasing a little bit in New England, but the volatility year to year is making it way more difficult for snow and ice contractors. Moving interior a little bit, we looked at Concord and we looked at Harrisburg, PA. So Concord, New Hampshire, and Harrisburg, PA. Similar idea, right? Temperatures have been sort of a steady state, slowly up. But snowfall has been pretty much a steady state held throughout the entire time. Concord's basically exactly where they were in 1922, 1923. They're essentially in the same exact spot. And Harrisburg, maybe a little bit less over time, but nothing drastic or nothing to draw significant conclusions from. But once again, you see a lot of these dots weighed in the last 30 or 40 years, showing the most variation over that time. So a lot of big swings from year to year, again, making it more difficult for snow and ice contractors. And lastly, we'll look at the Midwest as well, basically showing the exact same thing, right? Temperatures at Minneapolis, MSP, have been increasing. That's the bottom one there. And then temperatures in Indianapolis and Indiana have been increasing as well. That's this orange one here. Snowfall, we have MSP, actually has been showing a steady increase over time, if anything. Indianapolis has been kind of started okay, dipped down a little bit in the 40s and 50s, and has sort of flatlined over time. But once again, essentially all of the greatest variability has happened over the last 50 years. In places like Minneapolis, 4 of them have happened in the last 10 to 15 years. Indianapolis has seen quite a bit of variation as well. So the biggest takeaway so far is, right, first off, you need climate data, right? You need data, snowfall data, and understand those to really get an idea of what's going on at your particular location that you're servicing. Understand that climate may be actually making your job harder, but it doesn't necessarily show a decrease of snow events. And one thing that I haven't shown here that there's been a little bit of research on is that the warming temperatures, particularly in some of the more marginal climates, so as you head towards like New York City, Boston, the I-70 corridor, as you head through the Midwest, um, the smaller events may be decreasing a little bit, but the bigger events might be actually increasing a little bit. So I don't have anything to show here about that. But those are kind of some quick takeaways right off the bat. Now, okay, this is all good and well. What does this mean for you? That's where Neal's going to come in and step in and take us from there.
Yeah, so thanks, Rob. It's always fascinating to see the statistics and to know what's going on behind the scenes. And I'm always impressed with how much data and how much work you all bring to support us in the industry. And sometimes it can feel overwhelming, right? So the question is, what are we going to do about that? And I think the first thing is to understand, what contract types do we have as snow contractors? And so if you flip, I think we're prepared to slide with the different ones here. We have what Rob has dubbed the PERS. So this is per hour, where you're just showing up and working and charging for the work that you do on a time and material basis. Per push, meaning every time you show up to a site and plow the snow there or de-ice, you're going to charge. And then per inch, where you may show up to a site multiple times in a storm, but you're going to bill according to the number of inches that fall in that storm. And there's adjustments in here. There's combinations in here where de-icings can be done on a per push or per application basis, even though the snowfall is being done on a per inch basis. Sometimes we see contracts that are per push but have different rates depending on how many inches are on the ground. I think the idea behind the PERS is it's a variable cost model where you're charging for the amount of work that you're actually doing on the site. And then we have seasonal. Seasonal contracts are either a flat rate, where your customer is paying a flat rate regardless of how much or how little work that you do, or adjustable, where there's some sort of fixed cost and structured payment structure. But depending on the climate or depending on the number of services, an adjustment can be made in terms of a refund or a additional charge at the end of the season. And then there's also a little bit of an emerging model in snow contracts, which is a retainer plus service, where someone will charge, say, $500 or $5,000, depending on the size of the site. And that's a non-refundable deposit to have the contractor on board. And then after that is utilized, or maybe that's just a fee to sign the contract, services are done on a per basis. That may mean that services are credited against that retainer. It may mean that services are discounted in light of that retainer. Or I know some companies who are just charging a retainer just to be the guy on call, and services are charged as they are. Lots of options, certainly lots of room for variation in here between the varying services. I've seen contracts where everything falls neatly into one of these, 6 categories. I've seen contracts where the lot plowing is done one way and the lot de-icing is a different way, and the sidewalks are done, per hour, and you name it. You can be as creative as you want. And in fact, there's a case to be made that being creative by combining some of these structures is a way to change risk. But I think at the end of the day, what we need to get on board with is there's per occurrence billing and there is guaranteed money billing. And we have to understand the implications of both. Now, a lot of times when I talk with people, they say, well, how do I know? And it depends on the costs. And every business has 2 types of costs. There are costs that are fixed. So this is costs for your office, like your rent or your mortgage payment. You have some minimum utilities. You have to keep the heat set to at least 50 degrees. So you're paying something in utilities that could be considered fixed regardless of how much you use it. And you have office equipment that you've bought, whether you're using it or not. In terms of payroll, anything that's related to snow in terms of hourly wages that you're going to incur throughout the year, as well as any salaries for someone who's not going to be laid off, would be considered a fixed payroll cost for snow removal. Now, if you have someone who's doing landscape design and all winter long they're working on designs for clients, that's not really part of your fixed cost for payroll here. That should be attributed to your green side of the business, but a winter related salary is certainly a fixed cost. And then equipment, regardless of how much it snows or how many hours you put on your equipment, there's going to be some sort of payment or rental. Of course, the insurance policies that you have for your equipment and for your business as a whole are generally relatively fixed. But then you have a set of variable costs. So certainly in the office, our utilities are variable. The more that we work, the more we use the lights and the heat, the higher those costs can be. Payroll is probably the biggest variable cost for a business. So that's all the hourly labor that is dependent entirely on the weather. That's any overtime that's not budgeted, as well as winter bonus payments. I know of plenty of companies who have salaried employees who then get paid an additional hourly rate for snow related work. All of that is variable cost. And then for your equipment, there's of course fuel and repairs. There could be others. You may have some variable insurance costs associated. You really have to do an accounting of everything you're spending. And this is not necessarily a comprehensive list, but being able to quantify every cent that you're going to pay this winter and which portion of them are tied in some way to the climate versus which ones are guaranteed to be paid no matter what is a really important step. And you're going to end up with a number for a fixed cost. And that's what we have to secure in a guaranteed payment one way or the other. A lot of companies I know are finding themselves in trouble because they guaranteed that their fixed costs would be covered if they got 1 inch of snow or 3 inches of snow. And in the Philly market, they're struggling a little bit. Now, maybe in Boston, our lowest ever recorded, I think, is 7 inches or 9 inches. All right, perhaps you can get by with it. But while all the climate data is really nice to know, at the end of the day, we're pretty year-to-year businesses, and a 0 for snow can mean out of business. And so I just think, being conservative enough where, hey, at least we're going to cover all of our expenses and not go out of business here is really important. It can get complicated because you could introduce weather insurance policies. You could introduce contingency plans around dipping into savings or taking out loans. Those are all options available. But a lot of people I'm talking to are saying, I know I need more seasonal contracts, but who would buy it now? Or, yeah, that's great, Neal, but seasonal contracts aren't a thing in my market. To those people, you just are understanding the client perspective. If you really understood where a client was coming from, you would understand how to position a seasonal snow contract. There will be clients who will sign up for seasonal snow contracts, even though they got 0.1 inch of snow all year in their market this year. And the reason why is because you have to understand the financial factors. And so at SnowFighters Institute, we do a lot of work to equip contractors with the knowledge they need and tactics they need to be able to manage their business. And one of the more popular things that we've published recently is this financial factors of contract types. So we took all those different contract types and we put together a list of financial factors that a customer, an end user, would consider. And why would somebody buy a flat rate seasonal? Because you can see that contract type there. Well, some companies need total cost predictability. I sat down with a real estate investment trust, which is an investment group who buys properties and manages them, and their goal is to make a return for their shareholders. And they told me, Neal, we are a real estate investment trust. We have to know to the penny what we're going to spend. We cannot have any variability. We don't really care how much work or how much profit you make. It's all about knowing our costs. And if you can provide that, then you're our guy. Some companies are really concerned with their cash flow, and having consistent monthly payments is far more important than the opportunity for the lowest cost. I have some customers right now who are actually graded primarily based on their ability to spend money. And if they have money left in their budget at the end of the year, it is a major performance knock for them personally. And their next year budget will be a problem. They would love a flat rate seasonal contract. You just have to find the right customer and present it the right way. And this doesn't mean you work with customers who don't do that. It means you get a mix. So we'll move on from this. If you want more information, you should really check out the forum for sales events that we're having with SnowFighters Institute this summer. There's 2 of them, one in May in Milwaukee and one in July in Rockland, Maine at the Fisher plant, because we'll run through all of this in far more detail, as well as the tactics to go sell these. But
Man,
what I
I will
wanted
be
to
at I'll be at one of both of those, I believe, Neal. So
and Rob does a phenomenal job. If you think Rob is good in 20 minutes, you should spend a couple hours with him and me together, where we're really figuring out how to build out these models and sell it to customers. Um, so if you look at the site costs involved, this top bar in the yellow, this graph is dollars up on the left hand side, and inches across the bottom. And I built this very simple, oversimplified model based on about a 35-inch market. And so you'll see that on the bottom, the snowfall goes from 1 inch all the way up to 76 inches. Um, on the top, you'll see your total cost for your business. That's the yellow cost. And in orange, you see that there's a fixed cost, and in gray, there's a variable cost. And so the fixed cost is fixed across the whole range of snowfall. For here, I believe it's $12,500 for this site. And our variable cost starts at 0 with 0 inches and goes up to nearly 40 grand if we have 75 inches. Is this accurate? It's probably not this straight line, to be honest with you. One of the reasons why we see those winters with extreme snowfall is because we get a single extreme storm. And in reality, your variable cost in a 12-inch storm is not 12 times your variable cost in a 1-inch storm. But for purposes of this, without really complicating the picture, this is pretty good, right? And your variable cost increase. Now what I did is, on the next slide, I put together what these costs would look like against a contract that's a seasonal. So this gray bar on the top is your seasonal income. You're going to charge this site 40 grand. You have $12,500 in fixed costs, and this orange bar represents your total cost. So at 0 inches, there are no variable costs, meaning it's $12,500 in cost. And you can see this green bar, a tremendous amount of profit, making over 65% profit on this contract. But every inch that it snows, our orange bar of cost increase, and our green bar of profit decreases. Now, that's not a problem at 1 inch, at 10 inch, at 20 inch, maybe. We're still, I think the crossover there's about 16, 17 inches with this model, right? Where we're making 50% profit. We should feel good about that. But at some point on a 35-inch market, it shrinks to a point where it's no longer profitable, and we actually start to lose money. Here, that crossover is at 55 inches, but it can change. You have to actually put in these numbers yourself. And so this is not a model for success, a pure seasonal model, right? Because if it snows a lot or we get one big storm, we're potentially underwater. So we shift over on the other side of the pendulum to a per contract. And a per contract basis of revenue, cost, and profit will look like this. We don't actually make any money until around that 20-inch mark. That green profit is negative unless it snows enough. And this is where many contractors who are freaking out, the past few months have found themselves, particularly on the I-95 corridor. I know some of the lower Midwestern states have been in this situation, and some March storms have really saved us a little bit by getting us closer to that bar. But your revenue is not exceeding your revenue in gray is not exceeding your cost until a substantial amount of snow falls. Now, depending again on your contracts, on your rates, on your average, this is around a 35-inch market, will depend where that crossover is. But it's a lot of risk. And anything below that point of green profit is going to be out of business unless you have considerable savings or some sort of contingency plan. So what's the solution? The solution is to blend these together. And if you combine these exact numbers and do a 50-50 split between seasonal costs and per push or per occurrence costs, you'll see that in orange we have our dual site cost. And so I combine them together. We were at 12,500 in fixed costs, so altogether 25,000 in fixed costs here, and it increases up depending on the work, but our revenue outpaces us, and actually we do have an incentive to have some snow. The more it snows, the more we make. But look at our profit; it's never zero. Our profit is always guaranteed. We're always guaranteed to be in business. Will a year with 1 inch or 3 inches still hurt? Absolutely. But at least we can stay in business and go out next year and do better. Now, you can play with this model. You don't have to have a 50-50 split. You have to have enough seasonal to cover all your fixed costs. I'm hardline on that. You have to have enough per occurrence to make sure that in a heavy winter you don't lose money. But usually we see, depending on the market, that that's around a 30-ish% mix of one or the other. So as long as you have at least probably 70-30, depending on how much you've sold your contracts for, you'll probably be in good shape. Now, if you're selling seasonal contracts way under the market because you didn't use a climatology, then this model doesn't hold up. It's not just about the percentage of contracts. They have to be based on the right number. And so from all those fancy climatologies, you still have to choose a number to kind of anchor these models on. And that's where they become super valuable. Your appetite for risk may tell you, or your gut feeling may guide you towards a 5-year versus a 30-year average, because as Rob showed, they're all different. But at least you can build a pro forma like this and see what you're actually going to make year to year, depending on how much snow you have. Guarantee you stay in business and guarantee that you make money. And it's just not optional anymore. Maybe years ago, looking at some of that data, Rob, it didn't matter. It always snowed, right?
Yeah.
But when I was involved working with Case from 2010 to 2017, if I'm not mistaken, in those 7 years, I had to encounter the lowest snowfall in Boston history, including this year, at like 9 inches or something like that, and the highest at like 109 inches or something like that,
Yeah,
right?
you definitely experienced the highest, and it was one of the lowest. I don't believe it was
One
the
of the
lowest,
lowest.
but either way, you had 100 and something, inch it's change over just a couple of years, right?
A
That's
couple of years.
crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, right? So how are you going to make money? How are you going to scale for success? How are you going to guarantee that you can pay your people and your equipment? In those, it's by having a robust model and doing the math. You have to know your costs. You have to track everything, and you have to have the great weather data. And I, I've seen all kinds of weather data that's a mess. People send me stuff all the time and ask me where they should anchor it based on. There's just no substitute for the climatology, the Snowtistics reports that WeatherWorks provides. And if you're serious about it, you got to really get some of those. Now, do you have to get it for every zip code? I'll tell you, not really. WeatherWorks would love to tell you that. But Rob is exactly right. If you're driving to a site more than 15 minutes from an airport, NOAA is useless. The free information is probably terrible. And even for small companies, you need to be purchasing several zip codes, at least at the corners of your service area, to understand the differences, because that it snows very differently from one end of your surface area to the other. And so that means that your averages are very different, and your estimating models need to vary based on that really critical data point. It's truly non-negotiable to understand the difference. And if it's mostly the same, then fine, you don't need as many Snowtistics reports. But if you're doing a bigger area and it varies widely, and in the 95 corridor, that is absolutely the case, you really need those
Yeah.
tools.
Yeah, and I completely agree. You don't need one for all of your locations, but especially like Neil was just saying, the 95 corridor has some drastic differences. You get closer to the water and 95 itself. You go 10 or 20 miles to the west, you start to hit some elevation that snowfall can be 10, 20, 30% more on average. So, it depends where you are, right? If you're out in the Midwest where it's kind of flat, 20 miles isn't going to make a big difference, but 20 miles on the East Coast, you may want several of these climatologies to at least understand what your average is, and also what your maxes and minimums could be in any given year.
Yeah, and I think this is important. This mix is important. This data is important for every contractor. I'm talking with guys in Minnesota right now they're super happy because there's a ton of snow, but they actually don't know how much money they're making, and that's a problem, right? You can lose money even if there's a lot of snow, especially. I mean, when you're building these models and these variable costs, I know your estimate wasn't based on everybody working on overtime and everything that could break on your equipment breaking and having to overnight parts and pay for mechanics and all those things, right? So those heavy snow years introduce a lot of different things, and we just got to be prepared for them all as a professional company that's looking to keep snow as a primary profit center of our businesses.
Cool. So thank you, Neal. I really appreciate the insight. I certainly learned some plenty of information today. We're here for you, Neal. Obviously, you can reach out to him at nealglatt.com. Like I mentioned, or he mentioned, SnowFighters has several. It's not just May and I forget what the other one was in Milwaukee and Maine. There's several others throughout the course of the year. Correct?
Yeah, so in April we'll be down in Tucson, Arizona for our flagship event, the Inner
Maybe
Circle.
get some golf in there too, right?
We do have golf in there, and a tour of Caterpillar's Tanaha Hills Proving Grounds with the mining equipment. And we're at this casino resort and pool and spa, and it's going to be awesome. And we splurged on dinner, Rob. It's a very nice place, and it's including your registration too. Actually, two dinners. So
Beautiful.
I'm we're going to Arizona. I'm looking to have a good time, and I'm picking up the tab if you're registered with us. So that's going to be fun. Then in May we'll be in Milwaukee for the sales forum. In June we'll be in Detroit at Hot Pink De-icer, which is associated with Troy Clogg's Landscape Associates, their new facility, and we're doing an operations focused event. So that is really how to weaponize this data in terms of event preparation and crew mobilization, as well as talking about how to recruit people to do the work and manage them. And then in June, we'll be in Maine for that sales forum. And in the first week of September, we are in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia at FoleyCat for another operations event, which is perfect for directors of operations as well as field managers who are looking to get to the next level. So if you're interested in any of those, you can go to snowfightersinstitute.com, come hang out with Rob and I. If you're into golf, Rob needs very little excuse to book a tee time, so we'll make that happen if you want to go. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me. Be happy to chat with you there.
Yeah, and then from the data standpoint, feel free to reach out to sales@weatherworksinc.com if you have any interest in Snowtistics, or just getting a hold of us and we could talk to you about the data and how it may help you ultimately better prepare you for upcoming winters. So that's all we have today. I thank everyone for joining, and let's hope for some profitable winters to come.